Here we go. Okay, all set up. So we're just gonna cruise right into the next unit. So this will be unit 3. I will say this is a pretty tough couple, I guess, few chapters. So we're gonna go over 2 things called photosynthesis and respiration, which are basically biochemical reactions. It can be tough to understand. I'm gonna try to make it as clear as possible, but just know this is often kind of a tough unit for students to grasp. So I say that stuff not, like I said before, not to scare you, but just to kind of make you aware, so you're not going in blind. But ask questions as we go if you're confused about things. I definitely encourage still snap groups, so I'll still be giving bonus points if you go to any snap groups or one-on-one tutoring. So you can go to 1, you can go to 4, it's up to you, and I'll put those bonus points on the exam. So keep that in mind, that can be really helpful. Okay, so we're gonna jump in. We're gonna kind of start talking about energy before we actually talk about the processes of respiration and photosynthesis. Okay, so just kind of taking a second to step back and think about what we have talked about and then where we're going. We've talked about how cells are structured, what makes them up, the different parts that make them up. You kind of know a little bit about how they function, but we're going to talk a lot more about how they function and how they use energy. It's really annoying. Basically how cells use energy to do the things they need to do. Some of the stuff we talked about, like transporting materials across the cell membrane, that kind of stuff. Respiration and photosynthesis, that's where we're going. Those will be along with this energy information and thermodynamics. These will be the 2 main topics on the next exam. So we're going to kind of set up the background for understanding respiration and photosynthesis today and then Friday. We'll get into, I think, respiration on Monday. Yeah, so it'll basically be broken into thirds. So 1/3 will be respiration, 1/3 will be photosynthesis, and the other third will be this lecture about energy and thermodynamics. Okay. So let's talk about an ecosystem. We're gonna zoom out from the cellular level, which is kind of nice every once in a while, and think about how energy moves through an ecosystem. So energy, unlike nutrients, so nutrients are going to cycle, so they get reused and end up kind of going in a cycle around the ecosystem. Energy flows through the ecosystem. And what I mean by that is that energy is essentially lost each time one thing eats another thing. It'll gain some of that energy, but a lot of it will be lost as heat. So energy does not get recycled. It comes in, it moves linearly through, well, kind of linearly through the ecosystem. A lot is lost as heat. And then at the end, you have basically kind of the decomposers that are taking that energy. Anything left is lost as heat. So it's a one-way flow of energy. These little heat bubbles here are essentially some energy that isn't being used. So if this little rabbit eats this plant, so some of this grass, he gets some of that energy, but a lot of it is lost through heat and goes back into the kind of pool of heat energy in the ecosystem. The main take home from this, energy is moving through the ecosystem, not being recycled, and a lot is being lost as heat. Each time one thing eats another thing. So each time this energy is transferred from one level of the ecosystem to the next, a lot is lost as heat.
Do we have to know the percentage that is lost?
Oh, no, don't worry about that. No. No, don't worry about how much is lost at each one. I don't think I talk about that in here. Yeah. Yeah, good question though. All right, so energy flows. Energy is transformed each time, like I said, one organism eats another organism for food. In addition to plants absorbing energy from sunlight and converting it into chemical energy. So plants are going to transform that sun energy into chemical energy. That's basically what we use for energy. So the molecules that plants make just by absorbing that sunlight are what we consume and then break down for energy. We're going to talk a lot about all of this whole process in the mitochondria, which is where respiration happens. So first, photosynthesis. I think most people know the term photosynthesis and kind of have a general idea of what it is. This is that first part basically that I just mentioned. So plants are turning UV radiation, so sunlight, into organic molecules. Those molecules are then used for energy by organisms that eat the plants, basically. So plants are the first step in actually starting this whole energy flow. Without them, the sun would just be shining down on us and we wouldn't be able to do anything with it. We wouldn't be getting any energy without plants kind of starting this whole process through photosynthesis. They have to make, and we'll talk about this, but glucose. So they're pretty much exclusively through photosynthesis making glucose, which we've talked about, a carbohydrate. That's what we eat and we get energy from. We will talk about that in detail, so don't worry too much about it right now, but if you're wondering what molecule are we talking about, it's pretty much glucose. And then respiration. Okay, so only plants do photosynthesis. I think everyone sort of knows that. We can't photosynthesize. Respiration, plants and animals both do this. So plants are photosynthesizing, they're also doing the other thing where they're breaking down the molecules that they make, the glucose, and using that for energy. So cells are turning those organic molecules made through photosynthesis initially, breaking them down and extracting energy from them. That's sort of the really big picture overview of what we're talking about here. It's really easy to get lost in the details, and there will be a lot of details about respiration and photosynthesis. But try to remind yourself every once in a while, and I'll try to bring us back to this. What's the big picture? What are we trying to do here? Respiration, we're using organic molecules to turn them into energy. Photosynthesis, sunlight is being turned into organic molecules. And this is why I'm sort of starting out talking about energy. Understanding a little bit about energy is helpful before we jump into how we basically make molecules for energy. Okay. Some terminology here dealing with chemical reactions. You all have probably heard the term metabolism. We all have a metabolism. Some of us have a high metabolism. Some of us don't have a high metabolism. All that means from a kind of technical standpoint is all of the chemical reactions that are happening in an individual body or an individual organism. So the metabolism, your metabolism is basically just all of the chemical reactions that are happening on a second-by-second basis in your body. There are two parts to that. So there's the catabolic reactions or catabolism. These are reactions that break down molecules. So think of a really big molecule, like starch, something that has a lot of individual pieces to it. Catabolism will chop that up and break it down. That process releases energy. And when I say energy, I pretty much always mean ATP in here. I think I've said that, but ATP and energy are essentially synonymous for our purposes. So another word for catabolism, or another term, is an exergonic reaction. Any reaction that releases energy is exergonic. So if you think of like an explosion, that's a huge release of energy. So that exergonic explosion, it's a release of energy. The example here, can you open the door for her? Thank you. You can just leave it cracked, yeah. Sorry, I don't know why these doors lock. So respiration is an example of a catabolic reaction or an exergonic reaction. So you want to know both of these terms. They're sort of interchangeable. A catabolic reaction or catabolism, an exergonic reaction. These are releasing energy. What's happening in respiration, as I sort of already mentioned, is a cell is breaking down sugar or glucose to release energy. And that energy goes on to do something else in the cell that's needed. The other half of metabolism, obviously if we're breaking molecules down, we also have to build them. So the other half of metabolism is called anabolism. This is where small pieces are put together to make a big molecule. This uses ATP. If you think about like building a structure or a building, it takes energy to do that, right? So if you're building a bigger molecule from smaller pieces, it's going to take energy to do that. So energy is consumed, it's used, however you want to say that. Just like catabolism has a synonym, basically exergonic, anabolism also does. It's endergonic. Endergonic means it uses energy. So any endergonic reaction uses energy to make that reaction happen. It needs an input of energy. So thinking back to the biological macromolecules from the first unit, when you string together a bunch of amino acids to make a protein, that takes energy to make that happen. So that's endergonic. It's an example of anabolism. An easy way, I don't know if you guys have heard anabolic steroids. So anabolic steroids help you build muscle, right? If you don't take anabolic steroids, but for people who have taken anabolic steroids to build muscle, like professional weightlifters, or, well, they probably don't. But anyway, a false sense of building those big muscles, use anabolic steroids. So anabolism is going to build molecules, build bigger molecules, just like anabolic steroids will build bigger muscles. So if you kind of know that word already, hopefully that helps you remember that anabolism is building molecules. Okay, so that's metabolism. Commit these different bullet points to memory. I'll be asking about what catabolism and anabolism are. And I'll also be using the endergonic, exergonic terms, as well as which one releases energy and which one uses energy. So this slide is basically chock full of a lot of really important information as we move forward. Okay. Yes, and a nice diagram to kind of illustrate this, the anabolic and catabolic pathways. So if we're building a bigger molecule, so we have 3 small circles that we want to put together. We need energy to smash those together and build the bigger molecule at the end. Energy is required. That is an anabolic or endergonic reaction.
Is that your ATP, your energy?
Yeah, that would be ATP. Yep, exactly. On the other side, if we want to break this molecule down, chop it in half or chop it into 3 pieces, that's going to release energy at the end. So it'll be broken down. Breaking those bonds releases energy. So energy is released. That's a catabolic or exergonic reaction. Okay. Switching gears just a little bit. Still talking about energy. I'm going to talk about the two of the laws of thermodynamics. And thermodynamics sounds intimidating and scary. We're not going to like delve into a whole lot of detail about it. But it's simply the study of energy transformations, which is what we're talking about. Using energy to make something else, releasing energy so you can use it for something else. So we're talking about energy transformations. So I want to talk about a couple of the laws of thermodynamics here. The first one is the law of conservation of energy. This simply states that energy can't be created or destroyed. It's only transferred or transformed. So it's never made or lost. It just changes. That's the law of conservation of energy. So when that first diagram of the ecosystem that I showed you, as energy was flowing through the animals, some was being lost as heat. It's not being destroyed, it's just kind of changing form, basically. And the second law of thermodynamics is called the law of entropy. This is a little bit harder to grasp, I think, than the first one. This just states that every time energy is basically transformed into some other form, it's going to increase the disorder of the universe. And that disorder is called entropy. So entropy means disorder. What's that?
How's it creating disorder?
It's increasing disorder because it's basically, if you think about the heat example, the ecosystem diagram, so it's flowing through the organisms, but a lot of that is being lost as heat. That's considered disorder. And we'll talk about that a little bit more.
So being lost, the loss of energy?
Yeah, kind of. Yeah, you can think of it that way. I'll show you some diagrams that hopefully help explain this a little bit more. It's hard to wrap your head around, so I'm going to try to give some examples that'll hopefully explain it a little bit better. But yeah, you're on the right track. Okay, so those are our 2 laws of thermodynamics. I'm mostly going to be focusing on this second one as we move along, the entropy one. I know there's a lot on the slide. I'm going to break it down. So give me a few minutes here and hopefully it'll make sense. Okay, so now we have a new term to talk about, which is free energy or free energy change. So delta, that triangle right there, just means change. G is free energy. That's called Gibbs free energy. That's why it's a G. So we're talking about free energy change. So what is free energy? It's basically a system's energy that is available to do some kind of work. So free energy, it's free to be applied to some kind of work, whether it's like transporting something across a membrane or making proteins, that kind of thing. So whatever needs to be done in, say, a cell, free energy is necessary for that to happen. If we look at these pretty simple diagrams here. I'm going to kind of describe what happens in basically the breakdown. So you could go the opposite direction, but we're going to talk about a catabolic reaction sort of here. So we have, say, a molecule that's bonded together, and we're going to break it down into its component parts. Same idea with diffusion. I'm going to focus mostly on this, but molecules that are close together that will eventually over time spread out and diffuse. It's kind of the same idea. I think it's easier to understand thinking about a molecule breaking down, so I'm going to focus on this side. Hopefully you guys on Zoom can see this okay. Okay, so we're going to start at the top here with this nicely formed complex molecule. It has a lot of pieces to it. There's a lot of free energy here. So there's a lot of basically, you can think of it as sort of potential energy as well, if you know the term potential energy. It has potential to do work. So this has a high G. So this box is going to correspond to these two scenarios here. The entropy aspect comes in, and this is hopefully, this will make a little bit more sense with the entropy. This is a lot more ordered, nicely ordered than this once it breaks down. Same with the concentrated particles versus the particles that have diffused. This level has a lot of order to it. It's nicely ordered. It's not all spread out and decomposed like down here. So we would say that has low entropy. Remember, entropy is disorder. So if it's highly ordered, it has low entropy. It's also less stable. So anything that's kind of put together and sort of complicated like this is not very stable. It'll easily break apart. And I'll explain that. I have another analogy for that on the next slide. I think that'll make a little bit more sense. So there's greater work capacity. That just means it kind of goes along with the fact that there's more free energy. There's more potential energy to be released to make things happen. It's all held within this nice, highly ordered molecule. So then let's say we break that apart. So we have some kind of catabolic reaction happening, and we're breaking it down into its component, smaller molecules. So that's what's happening here. We're releasing free energy. So G is released, and it can perform work, essentially. So I could have a little arrow here pointing out to ATP or energy. So energy is a product as well. Now at the bottom, obviously we have essentially the opposite of what I have in the box up here. So now there's not a lot of free energy. This scenario down here cannot do a whole lot of work. So low G, it's a lot more disordered, so high entropy. It's now more stable because there's less breaking apart that can happen. So it's a lot more stable. And it also has less work capacity because there's less free energy. So it's already done some work by basically breaking apart, releasing energy. So now it just has less ability to do that in the future. If you are confused by this, don't stress about it too much. We'll talk about it a little bit more. It's not a very straightforward, super logical concept going into it the first time. So I like this analogy that helps explain at least some of it. If you think about a boulder, sorry, this is kind of blurry. You think about a boulder on top of a hill. This is going to be our free energy essentially on the y-axis. So it has a lot of free energy. There's a lot of potential for it to do something, right? Basically roll down the hill. Rolling down the hill is going to be our work. It's not very stable because it's on the precipice up here, right? So if it has a lot of free energy, again, something is not very stable. The order, this isn't a great analogy for the orderedness of it. But it does have capacity for work. It can roll down the hill, that's its work. Once we get to the bottom of the hill, so we'll imagine that the boulder rolled all the way down. It now performed its work, right? There's not much more rolling it can do at the bottom. So the ability to do work is significantly decreased once it rolls down. However, it is more stable. Once this rock is at the bottom of the hill, it can't really go anywhere else. It's not going to roll on anybody or anything. So it's more stable and less free energy. So less ability to do work at the bottom of the hill. It doesn't have anywhere to go, which means less free energy. Hopefully that kind of helps a little bit, thinking about if this were that kind of nicely put together molecule that I was talking about on the previous slide, and then the broken apart version at the bottom. All right, so that's the basics of that free energy change. So it changes as...
No. Yes, I can. Who's gonna stop me? Pew, 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 pew.
Someone's not muted.
Okay, okay, your pollo.
Yeah, I think you may...
Pollo, it's not ready.
There we go. Always make sure you're muted on Zoom. Okay, so let's look at some more graphs. Yay, there's a lot of graphs in this lecture. But this is comparing those anabolic and catabolic reactions, sort of in that same sense of what we just looked at with that boulder. But we're talking about reactants and products here. So a reactant in a chemical reaction and then products in a chemical reaction. So kind of the before and after the reaction actually happens. So we still have that free energy on the y-axis, G, here and here. And then what this is showing essentially is whether energy is released or whether it is consumed or required. So on the left here, we have an endergonic reaction. So this requires energy. These bullet points are really hopefully easy to understand, and I think do a great job. This graph does a nice job of explaining these. So I'll show you how it explains them basically. First off, anything that needs energy to happen is not going to happen spontaneously. And we'll talk about enzymes and how they kind of help reactions get going in a minute, but endergonic reactions or anabolic reactions are not spontaneous. They don't just happen. There has to be an input from an enzyme, and also you need energy for it to happen. So you need an input of energy here. So that's going to mean that the change in G is greater than 0. So a change in G of greater than 0 indicates an endergonic reaction. So if that change goes in the upward direction, it's endergonic and it requires energy to happen. So then the products are going to have more energy at the end of the reaction compared to the reactants. And then the opposite obviously happens with an exergonic reaction or a catabolic reaction. So we start with the reactants. They have a lot of energy at first. We're going to end with products that have less energy. So here we're breaking apart that molecule rather than building it. Delta G is going to be less than 0 or negative. So you start with a high amount of free energy, and then you end up with a lower amount of free energy. That means delta G is below 0. Anytime you see a delta G that's negative, it's an exergonic reaction. These reactions are always spontaneous, so they just happen. They don't really need a whole lot of help to get started happening. Okay. So the shape of these reactions, so that if we're looking at energy on the y-axis and time on the x-axis, the shape of this line with the reactants, in this case, lower than the energy of the products, that's always going to be an endergonic. If you have the products with less energy than the reactants, that's always exergonic. So try to, if you're visual, memorizing those general shapes can be really helpful to associate endergonic versus exergonic reactions. And we'll do a worksheet with this on Friday to kind of practice it a little bit. Okay. Moving right along. So what kind of reaction is happening here? Is this exergonic or endergonic? You have a 50-50 shot. Exergonic, yeah. So we're breaking something apart that releases energy. So think of something, this molecule is kind of exploding into a bunch of particles, so it's exergonic. Awesome. Exergonic. So here's I always think of like buildings as an example. So a good analogy for this, if you're demolishing a molecule, it's sort of the same as demolishing a building, right? So this building being demolished is basically releasing a ton of energy. So that explosion idea is releasing a lot of energy. So the demolition of a molecule, just like the demolition of a building, is going to release energy. It's going to be exergonic. In order to build that building back up, it's going to take a ton of energy, just like putting all these pieces back together to build that. So that would be endergonic. Okay, so what the heck are we talking about? That was a lot of kind of physics and chemistry, I guess, combined. Mostly physics, which we don't talk about a whole lot in here, but it'll be necessary in order to kind of understand the next steps. So we're kind of building up to this respiration and photosynthesis. So our goal is really to understand how cells do work. What are they doing and how are they doing it? Respiration and photosynthesis are both a lot of work, basically. So we need to know how that happens. We have some pretty big players. ATP you guys are already familiar with, that's energy. So we're good there. NADH is kind of another form of energy. I'll explain what that is when we get into respiration. Enzymes. So I'm going to spend the rest of this lecture mostly talking about enzymes. So enzymes make reactions more efficient. There's less energy that's needed to make reactions happen when you have an enzyme present. So if there's an enzyme there, it helps to make things just move along a little bit quicker. So those three aspects are going to be kind of the big players when we're talking about cells doing work. So let's talk about ATP. I'm actually not going to talk about NADH until we get into respiration. So I'm going to talk about ATP and enzymes real quick. Not real quick, but for the next few minutes. So back to ATP. We talked about this a while ago. This is adenosine triphosphate. The triphosphate is the really important part. There's these other two pieces that we're mostly going to ignore. There's a sugar and then the nitrogenous base, but we don't really care about them, especially when we're talking about energy. The energy comes from these three phosphate groups. So P plus 4 O's attached is going to be a phosphate. So you have phosphate, phosphate, phosphate. That's why it's triphosphate. And I circled it. So these three phosphate groups are important. Sorry, this is like right at the bottom of the screen. I should probably reorganize this. These three phosphate groups provide energy basically because they're really highly ordered. So they're all nice and orderly, especially compared to the rest of this. This doesn't look quite as orderly, right? These are all nice and symmetrical and ordered. And if you remember, a lot of order, highly ordered, means there's a lot of free energy, basically potential energy that can eventually do work. So that's why these three phosphate groups hanging off of ATP are the important piece of that. That amount of order is basically what's going to allow for energy to be released. And energy is released, I'll get into this, I think, a little bit later. But when you chop off one of these phosphate groups, you break that bond, that's when energy is released. So that's a catabolic reaction. You're breaking down that molecule, and that's going to release energy. So it's basically holding on to a lot of potential energy in these three phosphate groups. Okay, so specifically when we break down, I am going to talk about it. When we break down ATP, when I say breaking down ATP, we're basically essentially just taking one of those phosphate groups off. So we're chopping one off. This is done through a process called hydrolysis. which I think we've talked about before. Lysis means to split. So this is the splitting of water, which is basically part of what's happening, but it's also splitting the ATP. So it's splitting one of those phosphate groups off. So lysis means to split. That might be hopefully really helpful. And remembering that hydrolysis, is splitting ATP apart. That's what's going to release energy. So here we have our nice ATP molecule, 3 phosphates still strung together. Water comes in and chops off one of those phosphates. It becomes what we call inorganic phosphate, but it just goes off on its own kind of. Now we just have 2 phosphates, which makes this adenosine diphosphate, ADP. So you'll see ADP a good bit because we're going to go from ATP to ADP and then back to ATP. So it goes back and forth a lot, and it's probably really hard to understand which one I'm saying with the mask on now that I think about it. So I'll try to make it really clear if I'm talking about ATP with a T or ADP with a D. I'll have to think about a better way to say that. Okay. So yeah, water chops off one of the phosphate groups. It goes off on its own. You have adenosine diphosphate left, and then that released energy. So you have this little ball of energy. That's what can be used to do some kind of work in the cell. So you basically have to split ATP down to make it ADP in order to release energy. You have to cut off one of those phosphate groups to release energy. And again, that is a catabolic reaction or exergonic. There's a lot of terminology, a lot of new words. Okay, so we probably want to make ATP again, right? Instead of just breaking it down. So we broke it down, we released energy, but we need to make ATP in the cell as well. It doesn't just come from nowhere. So that process has a really long word for it called phosphorylation. This is just where a phosphate group is added to a molecule. In this case, we're pretty much talking about that phosphate group that was chopped off being added back to ADP, making it ATP again. So here, to create ATP from diphosphate, you phosphorylate ADP. So phosphorylation. There's 2 different ways this can happen. There's something called substrate phosphorylation. This uses enzymes and doesn't actually really make all that much ATP. It's used obviously and is helpful in the cell, but it has a pretty low production yield of ATP. It's not nearly as efficient as this other way. And by and large, I'm going to be talking about oxidative phosphorylation as we go into respiration, much more than substrate phosphorylation. So know both of these methods of phosphorylation, kind of basically just these 2 bullet points under substrate phosphorylation versus oxidative. This is what we'll be focusing on, which probably looks a little bit intimidating with this down here, but we'll get into that when we get towards the end of respiration. So oxidative phosphorylation involves something called the electron transport chain. It doesn't use an enzyme. So the electron transport chain happens way at the end of respiration, and a bunch of ATP is made, basically. It has a really high ATP yield. It's a very efficient way to make a lot of ATP. Okay, so we know how ATP is broken down and energy is basically released so it can do other stuff. That's why ATP is the energy, the fuel for cells mostly. And now we know how, very generally, ATP is produced, at least the term for it, phosphorylation. Okay. Maybe we'll stop there. I feel like that's enough for you guys today. We'll talk about enzymes on Friday and then practice with some of that endergonic, exergonic stuff as well. What's that? Yeah, I'm sure there is. Yeah. I can't think of it off the top of my head, but I bet there is. Yeah. If I remember, I'll go look for it and send it to you.